Say hello to my little friend. Let's rock.
They're heading for the roof!
Don't get your panties all in a bunch.
Hey there guys, Nordic Warrior here, welcome back to my video game review series. So those of you who have been following my channel will know that recently I've been reviewing several classic Duke Nukem games. In my last video we looked at Duke Nukem 3D from 1996, more specifically the remastered version from 2016. Before that we looked at Duke Nukem Forever. I'll leave a link in the description section to my other Duke Nukem reviews if you want to check them out. Today we're going to be looking at a spin-off game in the Duke Nukem series, and one that seems to be pretty highly regarded by a lot of Duke fans. Duke Nukem Manhattan Project, released in 2002, originally developed for PC. The version of the game that I played for this review is the Xbox 360 version, that was released in 2010. As far as I can tell, it's practically the same as the original, aside from a slight graphical upgrade. So Duke Nukem Manhattan Project came out at an interesting time for the Duke series. Due to the massive critical and financial success of Duke 3D in the 90s, fans were of course eagerly awaiting a sequel. The sequel, named Duke Nukem Forever, was announced almost immediately, and was originally scheduled to be released in the late 90s. And as we all know, yeah, that didn't exactly work out, did it? The game received many announcements over the years, and kept getting pushed back, due to technical issues during the development, as well as the game undergoing several engine changes. With Forever still in development, there were several spin-off games released across various platforms, in order to keep the series relevant over the years, and capitalise on the license. I talked about this in my review for Land of the Babes, which was a PS1 exclusive. These games tended to vary in quality, with none of them being able to live up to the standard of the legendary Duke 3D. Manhattan Project was a game that was specifically marketed as a budget title. What's interesting about the game is that it's very different to the other Duke games of the time. In fact, it's more of a throwback to the original Duke game, as well as its sequel, which, as I'm sure many of you know, were 2D side-scrolling platformers. The level design as well as the characters of the game are three-dimensional, as well as the camera angles, which change depending on the location, and can be zoomed in and out at any time. However, the controls and movement of the game are very much 2D in nature. You can only move along a very specific fixed path, and can only deviate from it in specific locations, giving the game a classic retro 2D side-scroller feel. This can be a bit confusing at times, with 3D levels and 2D controls being mixed, but you do get used to it after a while. The game is essentially a third-person shooter with platforming mechanics, with a very old-school feel. As I said, it's a budget title. The story of the game is a relatively simple one. A new villain, the evil mad scientist known as Mech Morphix, arrives in New York City. Using a green radioactive slime called Glop, he attempts to mutate various creatures, turning them into dangerous monsters, using them to take over the city, starting with Manhattan Island. Morphix and his minions have also kidnapped numerous babes, and are using them as hostages. Duke being Duke, he will of course have to traverse Manhattan Island, kicking ass, saving the babes, and wiping out the monsters en route to Morphix. That's about as deep as the story gets. As I said, it's very simple. And like all the Duke games, it doesn't take itself too seriously.
Pigs will fly before Morphix rules the world on my watch.
The game is split up into 8 different episodes, each episode consisting of a particular area of Manhattan Island. There are 3 levels per episode, the third of which ending in a boss battle. More on those later. As I mentioned before, the game is essentially a 2D side-scroller with 3D levels. The shooting mechanics, just like in all the Duke games, are pretty awesome. There are a bunch of weapons to find and use throughout the game. You start off with Duke's signature golden pistol, that showed up in several Duke games. It's the weakest gun in the game, but it does the job well enough. Later on you get a badass shotgun, which is significantly more powerful. An assault rifle which has a higher rate of fire, and is useful from long range, but not quite as powerful as the shotgun. A rocket launcher which is incredibly powerful and useful against tougher enemies. as well as bosses. A glop ray that restores mutated creatures to their original state. A pulse cannon which fires beams of electricity at enemies. In addition to these weapons you also have pipe bombs, which are powerful remote grenades. These can also be picked up before detonating them if need be. You also have a melee attack, which is of course Duke's mighty foot, where you basically kick enemies. This does a significant amount of damage, and can bail you out when you're low on ammo for your guns. However, it also leaves you more susceptible to be encountered. Ammo for each gun will be scattered around each level, and in most cases will even be dropped by enemies. I did run out of ammo on several occasions, but thankfully there's usually plenty of it. So yeah, the combat of the game is pretty solid, and just like most classic Duke Nukem games, you can carry as many weapons as you want to. In addition to weapons, there are also plenty of useful items to find and use throughout, as well as some power-ups. First of all, you can collect health packs scattered around the levels. Some of these restore a small amount of health, others a large amount. You can also regain health by defeating enemies. Defeating enemies with melee attacks gives you a slightly higher health boost than using guns or pipe bombs. You can find a jetpack at specific locations. This can be used to reach higher areas, as well as collectibles, and will sometimes be necessary to progress to the next part of the level. It's fun to use, but it can be quite difficult to control, but you will get used to it with some practice of course. As far as power-ups go, you have double damage. This is pretty self-explanatory. It doubles your damage output in combat for a short while. This can be very useful, particularly in the later stages of the game. And you also have a shield that basically makes Duke invulnerable for a short time, allowing you to breeze past enemies. You can also walk on hazardous surfaces such as electrified floors, helping you to reach new areas without failing. This is very useful for obvious reasons. The main collectible of each level is the nukes. In each level there will be 10 nukes to find. These are optional, but you do have an incentive to try to find them all. Finding all 10 nukes in a level will increase your stats for the rest of the level. This can be very useful, particularly against bosses. As I mentioned before, each episode consists of 3 levels. The main objective in each level is to find and rescue a babe, which will be strapped to a glop bomb.
Sorry, honey. I got some ass kicking to do first.
Defuse the bomb and escape the area, progressing to the next level. This will usually require a coloured keycard. This is of course a nod to Duke 3D, where most of the levels had areas that were locked off to you, until you acquired the necessary keycard to access them. This game has plenty of them. The game also has plenty of enemy variety. Most of the enemies are mutated creatures. You once again have the pig cops, which were one of the main enemy types featured in Duke 3D. Ratoids, which are mutated rats. Gatoroids, which are of course mutated gators. Roachoids, I think you get the picture. Glopoids, which are these mutated flies. And you even have some mechanical enemies. Femmechs, which are these feminist robots that try to whip you.
Die, bitch. I'm an equal opportunity ass kicker.
Security mechs, which are larger, more durable enemies. And hover mechs, which are similar to the sentry drones in Duke 3D, that fly right at you and explode in your face. Very annoying enemies that keep showing up in these kinds of games for some reason. One annoying thing about the combat is that some enemies will actually throw pipe bombs at you and are insanely accurate. But for the most part, when you get used to it, the combat's pretty easy. In most of the levels there will also be a bunch of hidden secret areas to find. Some of these can be found pretty easily, others are extremely well hidden, and in very obscure locations, and finding them can be a bit of a chore, particularly considering that the game requires you to travel across a fixed path, with little to no deviation. It makes missing a secret area so easy to do, and having to go back to find it is particularly monotonous. But thankfully, as you might expect, the secret areas are entirely optional, and you don't necessarily have to find them. You do have an incentive to try and find them though, since there will usually be a collectible or a few collectibles in these secret areas. Secret areas were of course a major part of Duke 3D, and certainly did their bit to add some replay value, and I suppose they do the same here, to a slightly lesser extent. In addition to the combat and hunting for collectibles, the game, as I mentioned before, also has plenty of platforming. Again, this is somewhat reminiscent of the original Duke game. Levels will be filled with traps and hazards, and Duke will have to use his acrobatic skills to avoid them. As a veteran of classic platformers of this kind, I really appreciate this. Unfortunately though, this does come with some problems. Some of the platforming sections, particularly midway through the game, are very poorly designed, and leave little room for error, leading to a lot of frustrating trial and error. For example, there will be enemies placed directly on ledges that you have to reach, as well as jumps that seem almost impossible, until you manage to slog your way through them after numerous tries. I also noticed some major technical problems. One problem in particular is something that a lot of 90s platformers had. The game's hitboxes are extremely confusing. There are ledges that clearly look as if you're supposed to be able to grab them, but Duke just won't for seemingly no reason. Also, for some reason I noticed the double jump, which is necessary to make certain jumps, just won't work randomly. Again, for seemingly no reason. Of course, leading to a lot of cheat deaths. This happened so many times during my playthrough that it made me want to rage quit. Another issue I had with the game, in fact this was probably my biggest issue with it, was the overall level design. It's just a real mixed bag, very inconsistent in quality. Some levels are very interesting and well designed, others are extremely dull, boring and monotonous. Some levels can be beaten in only a few short minutes, others take seemingly forever, and are filled with pointless backtracking and annoying difficulty spikes. Speaking of spikes, yeah, I mean that literally. There are spike traps at certain points in the game, and as I mentioned before, the hitboxes are extremely confusing. This becomes even more apparent when dealing with the game's traps. I mean seriously. Duke will immediately explode, despite not even being close to touching any of the game's traps. Then in other instances you'll be right next to them, and you'll be totally fine. It just makes certain sections of the game a complete chore to play. I felt like I was playing the original Rayman, which had the same problem. You guys might remember I reviewed that game last year, again link in description. One level of the game in particular that I couldn't stand was the factory level. Seriously, that level had me running around like a blue-arsed fly, with absolutely no indication of what I was supposed to do, or where I was supposed to go. It took me ages to get through it, and it was just filled with annoying traps and difficulty spikes. That's one of the things I was referring to when I said that the level design was so inconsistent. Visually there's plenty of variety in the levels, but not all of it looks great. You get levels that take place across rooftops, levels in the subway system, levels in the sewers, levels in Chinatown, levels in the docks, and you even get a pretty interesting level that takes place in space. These are pretty cool for the most part, at least visually, but sadly within these levels, certain sections are just completely dull and boring, and quite a lot of them feel copy and paste, which is amplified when you have to find keycards. In fact, this is actually quite annoying, because although some of the keycards are very easy to find, others are quite well hidden and require quite a lot of backtracking to acquire. Some levels will also require you to solve a puzzle. Most of these are relatively simple, others are a bit more difficult and may require some trial and error, but for the most part they're okay and I didn't mind them. As I mentioned before, the game has plenty of boss battles, each of them coming at the end of each episode. The bosses are relatively easy to beat once you figure out their patterns, locate their weak spot and learn how to exploit the AI. Some of them can be completely obliterated by leading them into a trap and just spamming certain attacks. I really enjoyed doing this. I enjoyed the bosses for the most part, and they do their bit to vary the gameplay. Adding some authenticity to the game, John St. John returned to reprise his role, providing the voice of Duke Nukem, and his voice acting is excellent as always. Duke once again gets some incredible one-liners throughout.
I go where I please, and I please where I go. I don't do windows.
The game also has some cutscenes here and there, helping to convey the story. As far as the graphics and presentation go, the game is of course a budget title from 2002, so obviously the graphics and character models are extremely dated, but they look okay considering. The babes do look kinda hilarious though. I mean seriously, who designed these? The Xbox 360 re-release looks pretty good in HD, so that's good, and that's probably the version you should check out. So yeah, that's pretty much all I have to say about Duke Nukem Manhattan Project. It's a pretty fun game for the most part, taking into consideration that it's basically a budget title. My expectations for it weren't very high. It does have some pretty major technical issues here and there, as well as some inconsistent level design, but that is to be expected given the nature of budget titles. It's a nice little throwback to the old 2D Duke Nukem games, and if you're a fan of classic retro platformers, or old shooters as I am, you'll probably enjoy this. Just don't expect it to be anything groundbreaking, it's pretty much what you'd expect. I give the game a generous 7 out of 10. It's not a masterpiece or anything like that, but it's a game that's fun nonetheless. Thanks for watching guys, stay tuned for more retrospective video game reviews. Once again, I have a lot of them coming to the channel in the near future. Thanks for watching and God bless.
Looks like your hardware's gone a little soft, Morphin.